Hello everyone, and thank you for waiting patiently before we begin. Apologies to our online audience for starting a few minutes late, but thanks for joining us again here for our next talk, which is being delivered by me. My name is WILFRED WRIGHT. I'm a curator, an art historian, and I broadly specialise in 20th century British and European sculpture, and in particular the art of Elizabeth Frink, who's going to be the subject of my talk today. Partly because there's a wonderful exhibition currently happening in the Salisbury Museum, where it's toured from the Dorchester Museum and Art Gallery, which focuses largely on the latter half of her life and her career, and builds a very successful portrait, I think, of her as a person. So I'd really recommend going to see that. But what I'd like to speak about more is Frink and her early life and career, and to really provide a bit of context in terms of her major themes and some of the key pieces throughout her career. So it's a sort of a survey, really. And I'd like to start... Oh, my clicker's not working. Should it be working? Oh, goes backwards. There you go. I'll start, as it were, at the end, because this is Frink's last sculpture. It was produced, well, it was unveiled 7 days before she died, in fact. And the reason that I'm starting here is because as a sculpture, this is sort of characteristic of so much of what Frink was trying to achieve in her work, and I think it's a nice starting point. So he's a lone male figure, standing tall, incredibly powerful, quite intimidatingly muscular in his physique. And his stare, this sort of gaze that's so palpable in a lot of her work, which looks inwards as much as it does outwards, is sort of characterizing the power of the piece. But also he's vulnerable. He's teetering on a precipice. He's standing almost completely naked apart from the loincloth, which was a specification of the commission. It's a commission for Giles Gilbert Scott's magnificent Liverpool Cathedral, Anglican Cathedral. And it's a risen Christ figure. It's a symbol of resurrection and of redemption as well. But also he's a martyr. He's been sacrificed for the cause of freedom, really, and for humanity. And so this sort of was the culmination in many ways. It's the largest piece she ever produced. And it's the culmination of her work, and sadly the last piece that she ever made, although it was never intended to be, and she had huge plans for the future. It's one of the great tragedies of late 20th century British sculpture that she never got to realise, a lot of them. But Frink was, from the get-go, incredibly mature for her years. She began... sorry, my notes. She was born in Thurlow in Suffolk in 1930, and the great drama of her childhood was the Second World War, which left her, in her own words, emotionally disturbed. She lived next to an operational aerodrome in Suffolk, and she remembered as a child watching the dogfights happening in the sky above her head and planes crashing to earth, and it left her with nightmares which recurred for the rest of her life, dreams of birds and things rushing past her head and big dark shapes in the sky. And she'd rush, she described, like little ghouls with her friends to survey the wreckage and collect souvenirs. And it was this very sort of strange time for her, not least because her father, who was military, he was a colonel in the cavalry, was called away right at the beginning of the war, and she hardly saw him for the rest of the conflict, and they didn't know for large periods whether he was alive or dead. The conflict, as well as the aftermath, seeing images from the concentration camps, particularly Bergen-Belsen, which was televised on British News in 1945 after it was liberated, left her with these images which stuck in her photographic memory. She had an amazing memory for images which would recur later in her work. And her early drawings demonstrate the sort of Gothic quality that came out of this quite disturbed, traumatic time for her as a person. And she was recognized very early on. Sorry, I don't know why this is. She was recognized very early on. She had her work, her sculpture, her bird sculpture. I don't know why.
Green button.
I'm pressing the green button. Oh, there you go. Her bird sculpture was a piece that was displayed in her first exhibition after she graduated from Chelsea School of Art in 1952. And this piece was purchased, it was in an edition of 3, and all 3 casts were sold in the first show, 1 to the Tate, where it still resides, 1 to the British Council, and 1 to the composer Benjamin Britten. And it just shows how sort of mature and successful her work was, even at this early period. And she was included in a spate of very important shows, including the Holland Park exhibitions curated by Kenneth Clark, where she showed alongside her heroes Giacometti and Rodin, who were largely responsible, along with her tutors, Bernard Meadows and Willie Sukop at Chelsea, for the working methods and the style that she developed very, very early on, which was to build up in layers of plaster onto a metal armature. You see from these pictures of her studio at Chelsea, she'd build up in wet plaster, so she worked very, very quickly, and incorporate all kind of bricolage from her studios, as sawdust and wood chips and bits of metal, and even bits of old sculptures as well. She'd routinely cut up her maquettes and stick them back together. And these would become the sculptures which she then had cast in bronze, but she would also cut into them, so she'd hack away, sometimes with an axe on larger pieces, and then rebuild, and then cut away and rebuild, and she'd repeat this process of addition and subtraction until the piece reached the sort of emotional intensity she desired. And one of the great successes of her early career was the monument to the unknown political prisoner competition, which was sponsored by the ICA and displayed at Tate when the maquettes were unveiled. And she was one of 12 artists out of 3,000 entries. It was an international competition, hugely publicized at the time. And she was one of 12 to receive a prize for her work. And so this was a very, very important milestone for her, and really set her on a path to become, as she's recognized today, one of the most significant British sculptors of the late 20th century. She was also, this is just illustrating, she was also a very accomplished portrait sculptor, but I'm not really talking about her portraits today because she didn't consider them as part of her oeuvre as such. It was an ancillary discipline that, although she enjoyed it and was very successful in producing portraits, it wasn't sort of part of what she was trying to do as an artist as such. And her early subjects, she settled on the subjects and the themes that she would explore for the rest of her career very, very early on. In the early 1950s, she produced a lot of animal sculpture, dead or alive. You can see the cats and the dead leveret, a particular favorite theme for her. And birds became probably her most important theme of that period. The bird, for her, she described it as flight. She equated to freedom. It was like this sort of metaphor for freedom that she included in her art. And the birds, therefore, have this very sort of slightly anthropomorphic quality, although they were never directly sort of referencing humans. They always had, all the animals had a kind of resonance with human activities and human thought. So the birds of her early days were very much this kind of latent expression of anxiety resulting from the Second World War. And some of them take on quite an aggressive quality, and this piece has been noted several times for its slightly sort of phallic implications with the neck and the head. And so one thing to sort of understand with regard to Frink's early work in particular, although it carried on and developed throughout her career, was her interest in existentialism, and particularly the thoughts and ideas of Jean-Paul Sartre, who was the great existentialist writer of the late 20th century in France. And Sartre believed that humanity was defined by its capacity for free will. And so every action, every choice that we made which resulted in an action was an act of, it was exercising this free will, and it was through those actions that we define who we are and who humanity, what humanity is collectively. And so for many in the late 20th century, thinking about this sort of intellectual discourse which was running through art schools at that period, especially Chelsea, her tutor, Frink's tutor, Bernard Meadows, was a great follower of Sartre and had an equal interest in existentialism. For many, thinking about how humanity had currently defined itself through genocide, world war, the destruction of the last 50 years, it was a pretty negative image of what we had become and what we were capable of, and this resonated with Frink and came out in her work. And so the birds, which had initially been these sort of explorations of animal forms, but also the notion of the beauty of human freedom, became ever more explicit symbols of the potential for harm and for destruction. So as the art historian Edwin Mullins put it, she reduced the animal form to a rather evil-looking pair of wire cutters, which is what you can see in these birds, which carry quite sort of sinister titles as well: harbinger bird, winged beast, etc. And again, with the standard pieces, these are sort of very sinister watching birds. Some of the standards are high up and they sort of stare down at you as you stand with them. And this is probably the most abstract that her work got in the late 1960s. She never really had time for abstraction. She, rather belligerently, the critics said, she had a difficult relationship with the art world and with contemporary critics. But she sort of belligerently but steadfastly stood by figurative sculpture in bronze in a way that few of her contemporaries continued to do. And so although she experimented with abstraction in these late bird figures and also with other commissioned pieces, she went back quite quickly to the human figure as a vehicle for expression. She believed it was the best sort of form for expressing her ideas. But more than any other form, it was the nude male figure. She didn't like sculpting women. She wasn't interested in female bodies, not for any reason other than that was, she described it as, she sculpts men like men sculpt women. It's a sort of an inherent interest. She enjoyed looking at men, whether at rest or, running or just being, and she was interested in masculinity, not in a macho sense. She never really had time for that, but she was interested in the concept of masculinity and what that meant. And so, yes, these are sort of some of her more ineffable abstract pieces, several of which have never really been deciphered because she didn't like to talk about her work. She was incredibly reticent. And pieces like Plant Head, which have never been deciphered, although it's been theorized that they potentially have some figurative elements. It looks like almost the dent of a spine and the curve of the buttocks at the base. But at the same time that she was producing the birds, she also produced a series of hybrid figures of these birdmen, as she called them. And these were, again, a development of this sort of existentialist idea of freedom and the potential of freedom and perhaps the dangers. They're figures of hubris. Some of them have their wings clipped, and they sort of still lean forward in this position of anticipated flight. It's a kind of aspiration to freedom that can never come to pass as they're tethered to their bronze bases. And again, it goes back to this sort of existentialist idea that freedom is the ultimate moral responsibility of humanity, is to exercise your free will, but do so responsibly. And it was a subject which she explored throughout the late 1950s and 1960s. But they become more and more pathetic and sort of prone to hubris. So you have these spinning and falling and fallen men. And they are, the fall of man has a sort of religious connotation as well. Frink was very interested in Christianity, although she had a very difficult relationship with her faith. And she was keen to disassociate them often with the story of Icarus, the boy who, with his father, made wings so that he could be free, that he could escape the island where he was being held captive. But once he had his freedom, he misused it, flying too close to the sun. And the wings melted and he fell to earth and died. But although she tried to dissociate herself despite producing this drawing, which I found, the sculptures and the works that she produced around this period nevertheless hold this similar message of hubris, really. And they were partially based on this chap who's Leo Valentin. He was known as the Birdman. He was a stunt performer who would jump out of an aeroplane with wooden wings and a parachute, and he'd glide down to earth before releasing the parachute. And he was incredibly popular and held rallies with thousands of people coming to watch. But very publicly and very tragically died in 1956 when he jumped out of an aeroplane 9,000 feet and the parachute failed to open and he just fell to earth, and it was all filmed and televised. And she was so kind of captivated by this, it was like everything she'd been thinking about to date, that that was one of the impetuses behind creating the Birdman. She wasn't the only artist, interestingly, to react to that incident. Cesare Baldacchini, who was a friend of Frink's and someone who she greatly admired, also worked on similar themes. And there's one of the Birdmen she produced at this time was the Alcock and Brown Memorial, which is in Manchester Airport, which I think is a slightly dubious memorial given the nature of what people are about to do when they walk past it, to have someone who's commemorated essentially for falling to earth and dying in a plane crash. But you'll notice that a lot of the Birdmen and the drawings as well that she produced in this period, one of which you can see up there, have this sort of spherical helmet, which I would argue is based on the spacemen, early Russian cosmonauts and their uniforms, which had these very spherical helmets. And this was a time when the space race and human exploration of regions that we'd never been to before was really taking off in a way that was unprecedented. And she was fascinated by the idea of space travel because it was this idea of humanity sort of going beyond its brief almost and pushing itself to places that it wasn't necessarily meant, we weren't necessarily meant to go. And also the spacemen had this incredible loneliness and vulnerability that she saw as a great metaphor for humanity in any state, and this was just a sort of heightened idea of that, really. And in the early 1960s were a very transitional phase for Frink. She described it as such, and she felt that the work that she produced in this period, particularly around 1963-4, was very important to her as a person, but also because it was a sort of culmination of the ideas that she'd been working on up until that point. And so Dying King was the first of these sculptures that she produced, and it's another fallen man. He's partially inspired by Laurence Olivier's performance in the 1955 film of Richard III, where he's knocked from his horse and has this sort of last desperate gasp of fight before he collapses and dies. And it's, yes, again, this sort of great figure of hubris and self-destruction in a way, because he's made these choices, he's made his existential choices, and thus not only he has been destroyed, but also he's created this terrible calamity, this war, in which many have died and been sacrificed. And it's also based partially on Crusader tombs that she'd seen in churches recently. Another of the figures that she produced in that year was Judas, who she described as more and more a figure of betrayal. And Judas is the first of her sculptures. Frink was very known for her goggled figures, which we'll see a little bit later on. But this was the first of those to be blinded. So he's pulled his visor over his eyes to sort of deny himself or deny the actions that have led to the situation he's now in, selling his friend, who was also the representative of humanity as a whole, and both humanity literally and conceptually, and in doing so, sort of betrayed himself and his kind, and in shame he hanged himself. And so this is this sort of ultimate figure of hubris. But then more hopefully in 1964 she creates First Man, who's an Adam figure. So he's humanity before the choices have been made, before these existential decisions have been reached. And he is this, he looks almost like he's like a sort of baby, but he's also got a kind of primate form. He's incredibly top-heavy. And although, again, you've got this dichotomy between the incredibly masculine strength and the sort of power of the physique, but also the thinness of the legs, and you see it in a lot of Frink's sculptures, these very sort of, well, bird-like legs. It's all a continuation of the birdmen. And so he's a vulnerable figure, but he's got this incredible power, and he's about to make the decisions. His face isn't fully formed. He hasn't got eyes yet. The eyes are so important in Frink. If they're looking, it's a sort of statement of intent and authenticity, whereas if they are visored, then it's a deliberate denial of that. And it was all a comment on how she thought that humanity reacted to situations. And the figure of First Man is undoubtedly based on Rodin's figure of the Age of Bronze, which has the alternative title Man Awakening, so it has this sort of appropriate lineage. And it was linked as well to another figure of sort of new birth and resurrection, which is the risen Christ for the Church of Our Lady of the Wayside in Solihull. And they're also linked because they were both based on her second husband. Her marriage had broken down in the early 1960s, and in 1964 she married Edward Poole, who was a war hero with a wooden leg. But he also had this enormous bushy beard, and she thought it would be a wonderful thing to combine the head and beard into this sort of enormous brutish visage. And that's what she based these sculptures on. And not only those, but the soldiers' heads as well. And there's actually, we have one in the gallery here. And the soldiers' heads are interesting because early on in Frink's career, she made a lot of figures which were titled Warrior. And actually, I think we might have a picture. So these are Frink's early warriors. And the warrior for her was early on a very sort of powerful symbol, very linked to her father, who was a military man, and she had many soldiers in the family. And she sort of hero worshipped them and thought that to be a warrior, that was the sort of the ultimate expression of bravery and belief, and doing sort of fighting for a cause, as it were. But then, as her views began to change, she changed the titles, and so they become soldiers' heads rather than warriors' heads. So warrior carrying these connotations of impassioned bravery and fighting because you believe in something. Soldier, you're told what to do, you're fighting for someone else's cause. So there's this image of inauthenticity, like the Judas figure. And that sense of inauthenticity developed into the goggle heads, which were the sort of natural development of the soldiers' heads, but they were, rather than being the people who were being directed, they were the directors. They were based on the dictators who she saw in newspapers. She was very plugged into current affairs and had newspaper cuttings all over her walls. And these images of dictators and sort of evil military men, as she saw them, inspired this series of sort of snarling, as sinister as you can get, really, heads. And this was one such example. So they have these goggles partly because they were sort of inspired by the Moroccan general Mohamed Oufkir, who was accused of murdering the left-wing politician in 1965, and he was all over the French newspapers. And he would always wear sunglasses, and she thought there was something very sinister about not letting people see your face, but also your sort of denying yourself a view of what your action, the consequences of your actions. And so in 1967, Frink was becoming increasingly out of touch with, or not out of touch, but felt that they were out of touch with her, the British art scene. And she was becoming very negatively criticised by a lot of the critics at the time, who were going hook, line and sinker for abstraction, which was the vogue of the 1960s, and the incredible work of people like Anthony Caro and the American sculptor David Smith influencing British art. But she was wedded to the figure and still believed that that was the vehicle she wanted to pour her efforts into in order to explore the themes that she felt were important. And so she moved away from the art schools where she'd been teaching at St. Martin's and the Royal College, where they'd almost all but abandoned life drawing as a discipline. And she decided to take herself off to the south of France. And her husband had bought a vineyard out there a couple of years before, which proved very unsuccessful, but made them a lot of nice wine. And so she moved out with him and set up a studio there. And it was there that her work really began to develop stylistically, because whereas before it was incredibly textured, and she'd need this kind of texture to have the light raking across it and creating shadow and drama, in France it became incredibly smooth, and it was about reflection, and the smallest details would produce these shadows, which she enjoyed. And not only did she produce the goggleheads, but she also worked on another significant theme for her, which was the horse and rider. And for her, horses, who she'd always grown up with horses, because she grew up in the countryside in Thurlow and had horses from a young age, and she thought that they were these paragons of authenticity. So whereas humanity had gone down a path of self-destruction and hubris, they had this incredible capacity to sort of retain their path, even if they were being ridden. They were authentically themselves. And the horse and rider is this negotiated relationship, really, where they're at one. Well, initially there was this sort of struggle, and her figures seemed to be riding with a very sort of tight bridle, and the horse resisting. But later on, they become very at one, and you see that in the later horse and rider figures that she did in 1976. This one famously just outside Ralph Lauren in Bond Street. And after her marriage with Edward Poole broke down in 1973, she came back to the UK, deciding that she had to sort of re-engage with the British art scene. And she had by then become a pillar of the establishment. She was a CBE, she was an associate member of the Royal Academy, she was a trustee of the British Museum and various other accolades, and had work in museums and collections all over the world. But she came back with her new partner, and they were married in 1974 and set up in London. And it was there that she sort of re-looked at this theme of the head that she'd been working on for so many years, and decided to produce another side of this sort of single strand of thought around brutality and authenticity and masculinity. And that was where the tribute heads came from. And the tribute heads were really a tribute to Amnesty International, which was a charity she was very involved with. And she described them as a tribute to the charity and the people who it helps. But they are the martyrs, those who've suffered at the hands of the goggleheads, essentially, and their evil henchmen, the soldiers' heads. And they have their eyes closed, but in a sort of introspective, thought-provoking, meditative way, rather than as a sort of visored, covered, blinded sense. And Frink actually incised crosses, I don't know if you can see, into several of them in the middle figure here, and actually the one on the left. They have these crosses here and in the chest as well. And it was almost a way of anointing them. They've kind of reached sainthood. She was very fascinated by the idea of martyrdom and that idea of self-sacrifice, no matter what the consequence to you, if you believe in something or you want to retain kind of that sense of existentialist authenticity, then sticking to your beliefs is all that you can do. And I think it resonated with her as well, partly because she'd stuck her course as an artist as well for so long, despite the consequences potentially to her career. And she produced a number of these martyred figures. There's several commissions. She never did a commission that she wasn't personally engaged with. She didn't like doing commissions that, even though she did portrait sculpture, it wasn't something that she relished, sort of taking herself away from the narratives in her art. And so these commissioned pieces, like St. Edmund, who was a 9th century English king who was murdered by marauding Vikings for refusing to recant his Christianity, they felt very resonant with her and what she was trying to do at the time. And she produced a number of independent works which had these titles which again sort of resonated with this idea of martyrdom, the Proto-Martyr in 1976, and again the Precursor. And this was a sort of development for her because her figures then began to have a lot more movement in them. And this was really the beginning of this archetype of the running man. She produced these at a time when she'd decided to move out of London, and she settled here in, well, actually in Dorset, but just literally over the border, very near here, at a place called Woolland. It was a schoolhouse. And there she created this idyllic rural life for herself, where she had lots of animals. She had dogs, fancy breed chickens, and horses as well. And it was a time when she could have her own studio, large space, and reflect on a lot of the themes that she'd been working on throughout her career. And this idea of the running man, the walking man, was part of this because it was really an exploration of selfhood and the idea of just simply being a as much a sort of action of authentic life as any sort of striving political action. And she produced a number of the running men throughout this period, but also these sort of standing and walking and sitting figures as well. So it's just this observation of maleness and of humanity and of being in the world in a very, again, existentialist sense. And the walking Madonna is perhaps the most iconic example of that. But she also did studies of animals, again, looking at horses just being in the world as this very sort of this aspirational mode of being, really. And she created a sculpture park in the grounds. She actually intended to open it up to the public, but sadly it never happened. And one of the most impressive sculptures that she had in the grounds were a whole set of these, which she called her Riaci figures, based on the ancient Riaci bronzes, which had been discovered off the coast of Italy in the sea in 1976. And these are figures that were modeled on warriors for hire. They were mercenaries, but they were treated like gods. It was sort of part of the contract that they'd be lauded as semi-divine beings when they returned from battle. And so she created these set of Riaci warriors. They're going back to this early theme of the warrior. But unlike the warriors of old, and they're more like the soldiers' heads in the sense that they've had all their weapons taken away from them. They're completely nude. And although they're hiding behind these masks, they still have this incredible sense of vulnerability. And they almost look lost if you look at the faces of the figures, just striding through the world, sort of revealing what they've done, really. And Frink did everything herself in her studio, so right from the beginning stages of the work, sort of producing drawings and small models. She would work up everything until the stage of casting, and even in the end, she'd do all the patination herself, particularly after she went to Australia and was so inspired by the landscapes and the colours that she saw there that she wanted to bring colour into her work. And you can see here in these later sculptures from the 1980s that colour became a really important thing. She most wanted to create a blue. That was her aspiration, but sadly no such patination existed. It's to do with splashing chemicals onto the surface of the bronze and applying heat with a blowtorch, which creates a reaction on the skin of the bronze that keeps this permanent colour. But until the early 1990s, nothing had been produced that would make it the blue that she wanted. And so we come again to the risen Christ, which was her final figure. Sadly, in 1991, she was diagnosed with cancer, and in the same month, she received this commission, and she was determined to do it. And it sort of kept her through her illness. She had large periods in hospital, but kept coming back to the studio and working on this large figure. And this was the only time that she ever employed help in her studio. She had an assistant just to mix the plaster and do some of the application. And as well as doing this, during that period, she became interested in other symbols of renewal, which she linked to this Christian story of the resurrection. But particularly the green man became a very potent symbol for her. And yes, sadly, she passed away in 1993 at the age of 62. and was a great loss to art history, but her work remains, not only in various museum collections. After her son's death, he donated her entire estate to the British nation. It's one of the largest bequests in British art history, and it's now on show in 12, well, far more than 12, but those are the 12 beneficiaries around the country. And you can see it throughout the world, including at Messums, and we have her studio as well here. Yes, so thank you very much. It was a very whistle-stop tour. I was pushed for time, but I hope that's sort of given you a sense of her work, and do ask any questions that you might have. Does anybody have any questions?
It's just a comment. The treatment of the subject of the Green Man seems quite unique in that it doesn't have a face peering out through leaves, which really is the archetypal Green Man. But you see the head has leaves on it.
Yes.
That is just a comment to say that's.
Well, it is unusual, and it's so. She received a book when she was in hospital in 1991. A friend of hers gave her a book called The Green Man and its history within England, and she was looking at all these different archetypes of the Green Man, and one of the things that inspired this figure and the sort of subtlety of it was actually a poem that she was illustrating at the time when she was diagnosed with her cancer. It was a poem by Rainer Maria Rilke, the early 20th century poet who was an assistant to Rodin, who was her great artistic hero. And he wrote about, there are two poems about a figure of Apollo, a statue of Apollo. And one of them talks about roses twining up the sculpture, and how that, that will be the fate of this sculpture ongoing, is to have the leaves pressing against its face. And so they're actually, you'll see they're rose leaves. And it's not really been sort of written about, but it's something that was very much in her head and something that she was reading at the time. And my interpretation is that that's the reason for this very sort of, because it's got a kind of classical feel, even though, I mean, the head itself, they're partially based on Mesoamerican archetypes, and also on early Irish stone-carved heads. She was partly Irish, and her, or had Celtic heritage, and her husband, his family, her first husband's family lived in Ireland, and she spent a lot of time there studying Celtic art. So it's, yeah, all these things kind of fed into the work. But you're right, it's a very different approach. So.
Thank you, that was a fantastic talk. And you have this intimate relationship with Frink. You have this intimate relationship with Frink, and I wondered, did you have a favourite period, or do you have a favourite piece of work, and why?
I think, I can't go back on there. It's not working for some reason. I am particularly interested, I think, in some of the really early pieces, because it's the time, it was a very sort of exciting time for her in the sense that she was engaging very directly with a mode of European philosophy which had been around for a very long time, but was being reinterpreted by artists in Britain in the 1950s. And she was very engaged with her peers, people like Kenneth Armitage and Lynn Chadwick. And so some of the early bird forms and the early bird men, I think, are really fascinating in what they express about these very sort of bold philosophical themes that weren't, she was trying to get away from any kind of narrative expression, but doing it through figuration, which is, yeah, I think that's, and also stylistically, I mean, it's an exciting time because she was pioneering her own way of constructing sculpture, which then, through her teaching, became very, very influential. And artists today, many will credit her with inspiring their way of working. Yeah, sorry.
So picking up on that, Wilfred, people describe, say, someone like figuration kind of goes in and out of fashion in a way, doesn't it, through recent art. And people describe Gormley, for example, as someone who is continuing the English figurative tradition. So obviously Frink is a major link like that. So I was just wondering how you see her legacy in terms of contemporary figurative work today.
I think she provided this amazing sort of linchpin for figuration in the late 20th century, because there were so many artists who abandoned figuration, but many kept the figure in their work as an integral part. But what she really did was she found a way of treating the figure as this sort of generic archetype. She never worked from life. She always worked from her imagination. And she used it as a very sort of conceptual vessel to embody ideas. And I think so in terms of her legacy, I think she gave people a sense of how you can bring the figure into contemporary art. People saw her work as very contemporary, even in the 1980s, as sort of conceptualism was the vogue. It was, she was being lauded as one of the great sort of artists of the age, and she was given a retrospective. She was the first woman to be given a solo exhibition in the main galleries at the Royal Academy in 1985, and she was actually offered the presidency of the Royal Academy in 1985 at the time when the RA was trying to sort of diversify more and more and become a much more sort of young and conceptual place of learning. So I think she was an incredibly strong and certain person, and I think that comes across in her work. And so yeah, I think that's her legacy, is she provides this real linchpin for figuration in late 20th century art.
Yes. You mentioned her father.
Yes.
And her, I guess, missing her father through the war years. Did he survive the war?
He did, yes. So he was on the last boat out of Dunkirk and made it home in 1940. And then he continued to fight. He was in the Burma campaign, but eventually made it back. And although he died sadly, in fact, he was very, very ill in the next few years and died only several years later. But she did, yes. She was reunited with him.
Do you think that influenced her work and her fascination with the male?
Absolutely,
form?
yeah. She was very, very sort of inspired by her father as a figure. I think he was quite an impressive man. And I think that sort of gave her this love of masculinity, really, because he provided this paragon of masculinity for her in her youth. And him and his friends, fellow cavalry officers, she loved sort of watching them in their uniforms, thought they were very glamorous.
Also that conflict between the hero and
absolutely, exactly, and that conflict as well, I think, between what he believed in, because he was a soldier by profession, as were many of her relatives and friends, and she was always fascinated by military men. I mean, all of her, or many of her relationships were with soldiers or ex-soldiers. And particularly decorated war heroes. She had a definite love of people with medals. But she had this real conflict between that and the nature of conflict and what that really implies, or where the impetus to go to war comes from. And so that's what she was trying to sort of delve down into, I think, is she was fascinated by masculinity, but concerned about or interested in what the consequences of traditional masculinity were. Yeah. But her father also took her to Italy in 1947, which is something that not many people were able to do. But he was posted there in Trieste, and it was going to Venice that actually really inspired a lot of her sculpture, seeing the public sculpture there, and particularly the interaction between sculptures. And that's something she was really interested in throughout her career, was the reaction or the interpretations that can be got from interaction between her works. So that was, yeah. And he had a great love of art as well. Anybody else? Hi.
Never in the history of humanity have people, artists, not made figures.
Yeah.
Do you think there's maybe a little bit too much made, and maybe it should be revised that with the dawn of abstraction, that it wasn't a case that artists either became unpopular or everybody went to abstraction, but it went on, and there's a good history of it?
Absolutely, no, it is a slightly oversimplified interpretation, but I think the thing to remember at this point in art history in this country, anyway in particular, was that it was a time when the curriculums of art schools were really being revised and changed. And so, I mean, they took away life drawing in in St. Martin's, where she was teaching at the time. And it was the sort of the dismissal of the life room that she found so jarring and just couldn't get her head around. So although obviously, yeah, it was figuration and abstraction have been around forever. They've ebbed and flowed and interacted in many ways. But I think it was the sort of politics of it that she struggled with. And she didn't like that at that time, because it was, you know, it was a fashion, she didn't like that artists like her and like others whom she respected were being sort of pushed out of exhibitions in favor of some of their contemporaries purely because of formal technique, basically. And I think, yeah, so you're absolutely right. It's a slight oversimplification, but I think that's what she was personally reacting to.
Although she didn't use the life room herself?
Yes, that's a very interesting. So she did draw from the figure sometimes, but not in her end work. So Frink had as I say, she had a sort of photographic memory and this amazing sort of retention for images. And that was something which she would hold on to for a very long time, and she would always study the figure, but then would sort of change that in her head and, yeah, bring it into a sort of more archetypal sense. But you'll notice in her work, I mean, it's incredibly adept in the way that it's, deft, sorry, in the way that she actually models the human body. And although it's exaggerated, it is all taken from proportions of life, and they have this amazing sort of presence because of that. But yes, it's a very interesting observation, and certainly true. But I would argue that she sort of did use the life room, but in a sort of developed sense. It wasn't so literal as translation. Yeah. I think, yes, I think we'll have to wrap up that one. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for listening.